Hi, my name is Michael Sullivan. My wife Betty and I own this 1910 Perry Model 40 5-passenger Touring. We live in Newbury Park, California. Let me show you some of the features of this 1910 Perry Model 40. First, I would point out that it has 27-inch rims and tires on it, sitting on a 112-inch wheelbase. As I move down this side of the car, this car is a flat firewall, no front door design. And what's unique about this car for 1910 is that David Perry, who started the Perry Buggy Company and also the Perry Automobile Company, experimented early with metal skin bodies over wooden frames. And this is similar to what was common a little later in the teens. And so this was an early model of metal skin over a wood frame, which was not that common in 1910. The suspension on the car has full elliptical rear springs and semi-elliptical springs in front. It has a full differential with a drive shaft. And also would point out, when you see pieces on the car that are painted gray, those are pieces that I have restored and put back on the car. And the reason I've done that is that this is an unrestored, original car that came out of the Harrah's Museum. And so I've tried to identify any parts that I have repaired, I have identified by painting a different color as part of the repair process. Point out the brakes on this car. The brakes have rear drum only, but they have two sets of bands on the drum. The external brake bands are for the foot pedal, and the internal brake bands, which you can't see, that are inside the drum are for the emergency brake. So it's a fairly sophisticated, for 1910, setup for the brakes. And the brakes work fairly well. Again, the external brakes being the foot pedal brakes. This is the rear of the car, and here is the differential. It's a full floating differential in that it's connected to the fully elliptical springs by a spring perch which is greased and will twist on the axle on the rear end housing. There are two supporting struts that hold or provide stability to the rear end, and they are bolted both to the differential housing as well as to the frame, and they can be adjusted to provide alignment to the differential. This has an enclosed drive shaft, and just in front of the enclosed drive shaft is a U-joint that's also enclosed at the back of the transmission. I also have an Airmore exhaust horn that I use because the standard air bulb horns are not very loud on these cars, so having an exhaust horn allows me to let people know that I'm coming if I don't think they've seen me. I'd like to point out another feature of the body construction. It's what's called a piano body construction. It's very common in horse-drawn carriages to have this sort of structure. The supporting structure is here on the lower portion that sits on the frame, and then both the front and rear seats from the top down to here. This was a fairly common construction technique in horse-drawn carriages. In fact, as I mentioned before, this body has metal skin over a wooden frame, and this was an experimentation in body construction that David Perry carried over from his horse-drawn carriage company, which was called the Perry Buggy Company. I'd like to point out a few unique features of this particular automobile. The Perry Automobile Company was incorporated in July of 1909 by David Perry after he lost the Overland Car Company, which he also started, to John Willis. The cars started to be produced in September of 1909, and this is car number 228. It's the only surviving 1910 Perry model that is known. And so this is car 228, probably built in late November or early December of 1909. This car is a survivor in that it's mostly original. It has the original paint, the original brass works, and it also has the original leather. You can see, although worn out, the leather is still fairly supple, and although broken through in some places. These are the original seats with the horsehair filling or stuffing that were made in 1909. Since I have the seat out, I can also point out that the gas tank for this car is underneath the front seat, underneath this door. You can see the gas tank. It still has the original brass cap on it. And if I need to determine how much fuel I have, I can use this measuring stick, put it into the gas tank, and I can see that I have about 3 gallons of gasoline left in the tank, and so I can estimate about how far I can drive given how much gas I have left. Other features in the driving compartment of the car, note that the car is right-hand drive. It has a speedometer, it has a coil box and ignition switch. This is the coil box. It has an ignition switch. We can run off battery or magneto. There's a speedometer on the car. It has a brass steering column and steering wheel. On the steering wheel itself is the accelerator and the spark advance, and those are used to drive the car. I'll point those out when I start the car for you. And also on the dash is an oil sight glass, and that what happens is there's an oil. This car is unique in that it has in the oil pan is an oil pump, and that pumps oil from the pan to the sight glass on the dash. You can see oil flowing through the sight glass when you're driving the car, so you know you have plenty of oil, and then it goes back down to the oil pan, and so it's a circulating oil system, and so it's a way to make sure that the car has sufficient oil in it. Other things next to the oil sight glass is an original a car tag that has both the chassis number and motor number on it. As I noted, this is a car with motor number 228. And next to it is a 7-day wind-up clock, which is used when I'm touring to give an estimate of the time, but we wind it and it will run for 4 or 5 days, and it's actually fairly accurate. A couple of other features I'd like to point out is there's a hand emergency brake that is just outside the body above the fender and running board, and so pulling the emergency brake back locks the rear wheels. And then the shifting quadrant is right next to the emergency brake, and it has a standard American 3. It's reverse and first in the first quadrant, and then in the second quadrant is second gear and high gear or third gear, and so it shifts with a clutch and a brake. And what's interesting is that the floor pan, which has the Perry name on it, also identifies by wording both the clutch and brake for the new driver that may not have had a car before. One other feature I'd point out is I mentioned earlier the air horn that's on the muffler, and it's used to create a lot of extra noise, because the standard horns, which I'll honk for you, are just not that loud. And so this is a foot pedal, and if I were to press when I'm driving this pedal down, it opens a valve and it allows exhaust to go through the horn and make the noise. As I mentioned previously, there's also this bulb horn, which is easy to use when you're driving, and this horn is the original type of horn based on factory photos. Oh, do it again. Sorry. I'd like to point out that on the car there are several items that have the Perry logo. The first is the hubcap. It says Perry Automobile Company, Indianapolis, Indiana. Another feature that has the Perry name are the sill plates in the front door that say Perry Company. In addition, as we come to the front of the car on the brass headlights, each headlight has on the chimney has the name Perry Company on it, as well as the radiator has the Perry name. And the last several features are these, the brake pedals both say Perry Company on them, as well as this floor plate also has the Perry logo. And those are uniquely cast Perry parts that are only on this car. I'd like to point out some features of the engine. This is a 4-cylinder, 40 horsepower, with cylinders cast in pairs. And it also has an overhead valve configuration. Let me show you what the engine looks like. We're on the manifold side of the engine. What's interesting about this car is it has these very long exhaust manifolds, almost like a modern day header, where each piece is about the same length and feeding into a single exhaust. The intake manifold is aluminum. It's a Y shape, and at the bottom of the aluminum manifold was where the carburetor would bolt. I have modified this to accept a more modern Carter BB1 carburetor, but the original Schebler carburetor would hang in the very same position. Also on this side of the engine, you can see the water manifold that brings water from the top of both heads into the top of the radiator. The water will then fall through the radiator and be cooled by this aluminum fan, and then circulate back through a water pump, which is on the other side of the engine, which I'll show you. But also want to point out, on top of the engine you see the 8 valve units that are external on top of the heads, and they have to be oiled independently each time the car is driven, and they are also adjusted independently. And you can see the rocker arms on top of the engine that open and close the valves as the engine is running. In fact, once we start the car, we'll open the hood up and you can see the rocker arms in action. On the other side of the engine, you can see more of the valve train, the long lifting rods that go all the way from the camshaft and guides up to the rocker arms, and then as they push up on this side, they push the valves down. There are a single spark plug for each cylinder, run off a Kurtz magneto, K-U-R-T-Z, and that's the original magneto that came with the car in 1910. Also on this side of the engine, running off an auxiliary shaft, is a brass water pump that pumps water from the bottom of the radiator into both sets of cylinders, and then through around the cylinders and into the tube that we saw, that's here on top, that we saw previously. On this, running off the same shaft as the water pump, is the magneto. And again, this is a Kurtz magneto that it's a low tension magneto. It needs an external coil, and it runs the 4 spark plugs. And then the last feature I'll point out is the open flywheel, right back here. And just above the flywheel is a pointer right here. And that pointer is used to set the valve timing. There are marks on the flywheel, and as you rotate the engine through the various cylinders and their firing order, you can adjust each of the valves based on marks on the flywheel. Alright, there are several steps that driver needs to go through in starting a Brasier automobile. And the first are 2 things that have to be adjusted here on the steering column. This is the spark control, and on this we always want the spark in the retarded setting, and so I will push the spark lever down into the retard setting, and I'm going to open the throttle just a little bit. The other handle is the throttle. I'm going to check to make sure the car is in neutral, which it is, so if I don't start the car and it starts running. I'm going to reach over and put the choke on. That's an auxiliary Holley choke adjustment. And the last thing I'm going to do is put the switch, ignition switch, onto battery, because that's how we start the car. Okay, we're going to try and start the car. I'm going to first put my driving gloves on, which makes it a little bit easier to grab the starting handle, starting crank. I'm going to engage the crank, and I'm going to push down and then pull it back up the other side, and hopefully the car will give us a start. If you come over here, you can see the rocker arms on the valve mechanism working. Notice on the engine, you have the valve mechanism, the rocker arms being pushed up and opening the valves in sequence. And all these need to be oiled about every 50 to 100 miles when you're driving. You can also see in the back the open flywheel that's turning, and so a lot of the pieces of the car are exposed.